As you've heard now, President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration ceremony will be scaled back quite a bit because of COVID-19 and ongoing security threats against the U.S. Capitol. An event that normally draws in crowds by the hundreds of thousands will now be far more muted, as officials urge people to stay home. Most of the ancillary events, such as the parade and the inaugural ball, have also been converted to virtual productions because of the pandemic and following the storming of the U.S. Capitol on the 6th of January. New York Times bestselling author Kenneth Davis is with us now on the changes and some of the history behind these traditions. Ken, it's good to see you. Happy New Year. So, President-elect Biden's inauguration will feel unlike anything we've ever seen. But is it really the most unusual swearing-in ceremony for a president?
Without question, this is unusual and unprecedented. The only thing that even comes close, Vlad, and good morning, it's a pleasure to be with you again. The only thing that even comes close, I think, you'd have to go back to 1861. Abraham Lincoln is elected, of course. The country is coming apart at the seams as states have begun to secede. Georgia, in fact, seceded on this date in 1861. So Abraham Lincoln was coming into office, and the inauguration was in March back then, changed to January much later. And armed cavalry were guarding the inauguration. But it was still an inauguration. We have photographs of it where there were large crowds and similar in many respects to all of the traditions going back to the very first one, where so many of our traditions were established. George Washington in New York City.
So let's speak about some of those traditions. The parade, the inaugural ball, these are all going to be virtual, right? I mean, I don't even know exactly how you sort of pull off a ball virtually, but you know it's not going to be the same. Still, they're going forward with them. Can we talk a little bit more about, you know, sort of when these traditions started and why you think it's important to have them, even though they're going to be in virtual form? We should still move forward with them anyway.
I think you're very right, Anne-Marie. You know, we don't have a lot of formal ceremonies in America. We are somewhat casual, and the country wanted to reject the aristocracy, the pomp of the monarchy in England. So George Washington comes to New York to be inaugurated, and he walks through the crowd, beginning the idea of the processional. He then takes a oath of office in public. He's wearing a very simple brown suit made in America. The idea that this was going to be the beginning of presidents prompting and promoting Made in America begins with Washington at his inaugural. Tradition says that he bent over and kissed the Bible and used the words, "So help me God," which are not part of the constitutional oath of office. But there's no contemporary reference to confirm that. It was something that was said later on, but certainly most, if not all, presidents since have used those words, "So help me God." They are not in the Constitution. Later that night, there was festivities. There were fireworks. Washington talked about the crowds. It was almost impossible for him to get back to his home that day. The first ball was delayed because Mrs. Washington had not yet arrived in Washington, in New York City, forgive me. So all of these traditions really do begin with the first, and they gain more tradition over the years. The very first time we have a transfer of power, Washington gives way to his vice president, John Adams, who is accompanied by his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. What an extraordinary moment. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, all in the same place for this transfer of power. So this has been our tradition, our ceremony. The only other thing that approaches it is the State of the Union, this very formal affair. But we need these things in a sense. It does bring us together. And so it is unfortunate in many respects that this year, because not only of the crisis, the political crisis, but the pandemic, we cannot have this very shared moment of American pride and patriotism.
Ken, as you know, the inauguration address gives the incoming president a chance to set the tone for his administration. Let's play a short clip of one of my favorite inaugural addresses. It's President John F. Kennedy delivering his address 60 years ago.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace.
I know, Ken, everybody has their favorites. My guess is that if you think that the second inaugural address from President Lincoln is probably one of the greatest speeches ever written for an inauguration, this comes pretty close, but you might have one that you think is more towering. But what would that speech be, and what do you expect to hear from President-elect tomorrow, Biden?
Well, I have a sort of top 10, and certainly Kennedy's is in there. Both of Lincoln's, of course, are right at the top. Not only the second, which is majestic, but the first, which is also American poetry. Washington's first is quite interesting because, again, it set the precedent. His second, by the way, was only 135 words long. He kind of dispensed with that. But the other one that comes immediately to mind is right up there at the top is Franklin D. Roosevelt coming in and telling America that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself. Trying to talk about a nation that was being torn apart and jittery, coming in at the peak or the depths, I suppose, of the Great Depression, and certainly another ringing speech that goes down in American history.
You know, so tomorrow the theme is going to be America United, very fitting considering the times that we are living in. But there are sort of two audiences, right? The domestic audience for sure, but also the rest of the world will be watching. How important is the inauguration when signaling to the rest of the world that despite whatever they may be reading about what's happening in the United States, that the democracy is working here and the republic remains strong?
I think that's a really important point, that this is something that the world will watch, and the world certainly watched with horror, as most of us did 2 weeks ago on January 6th, this incredible sight, the first invasion of the Capitol since the War of 1812. An extraordinary moment in all of American history. So I think that the world, as many Americans, are looking for the reassurance that some of the traditions and norms that Inauguration Day really imply have returned. We do have it is a tradition. There are formalities. There's something, though, completely American about it, but also very common about it. The idea that the president gets out and walks a part of the way in the procession, that was changed, of course, because of the security risks that began after President Kennedy was assassinated. But presidents have tried to do that. It's this moment where they try and say, I am with you, I am part of the people. So I think that that's what we're going to see, or wish we could see, the president with the people. It's not going to happen. But the words have to really be about how we are going to get back to fundamental ideas of what America is. Not America of carnage, but America troubled, torn, pulled asunder, but still united by some very profound ideals: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The government only governs with the consent of the governed. Those are the ideas in the Declaration. Those are the ideas that presidents have spoken to for most of our history. And I fully expect President Biden will bring a message like that tomorrow.
Ken, before we let you go, something else that's sort of unprecedented. We have video here from 2017 when President and Mrs. Obama had the Trumps over for tea, and the nation watched as the Trumps bid farewell to the Obamas as they left the White House. It's sort of remarkable, and we were showing some of those inauguration speeches from the past where you always see in modern American history, ever since the advent of video and film, the outgoing president sitting in the audience. You know, when I think back to the kinds of things that President Trump said about President Obama, the things that were said about Mrs. Obama, they could have very easily been ungracious and not wanting to spend any time with the Trumps. But you see them there. You see there's that moment in the Oval Office when President Trump was sitting with President Obama. And, you know, it's just sort of striking that this president has chosen not to do that. Now, we've talked a lot, Ken, on our broadcast, Anne-Marie and I, about Andrew Johnson refusing to attend the inauguration. But you know, I'd forgotten that President Eisenhower and President Truman did not have the warmest of relationships. And even though they were together on Inauguration Day, it was very, very frosty. But this is something unprecedented going back to Johnson, who, by the way, was also impeached.
That's correct. That is the other connection between this president and President Andrew Johnson. They were both among the three presidents impeached. The other instances, by the way, of presidents not attending the inauguration have another connection. John Adams didn't attend Jefferson's, also a frosty relationship, and John Quincy Adams did not attend Andrew Jackson's inauguration. Now, part of that was the tradition hadn't truly been established yet, but certainly part of it was the animosity between the outgoing and the incoming president. But as you mentioned, this hasn't happened since 1869, so it's an extraordinary moment. And even though Truman and Eisenhower might not have been friendly at that moment, they had been very friendly in the past. In fact, Truman once offered Eisenhower to become president while he was the victorious general after World War II. He actually said that I would become your vice president. Their relationship obviously changed in the coming years, but they still maintained the aura of dignity. The other thing that's obviously changed is we don't have top hats anymore. Let's bring back the top hat.
You know,
I'd second that.
Yeah. So, you know, Anne-Marie, Ken, you could correct me if I'm wrong. I always believed, and maybe I read this somewhere when I was a kid, that the reason that we don't have top hats anymore, even though I think President Kennedy wore one to the inauguration when he was riding in his limousine, he didn't wear one. He didn't wear a hat when he was giving his inaugural speech. And that seemed to change. That's when sort of hats started to go out of fashion in America, because Kennedy was not, you know, he didn't wear them as often as his predecessors and other men, I guess, in the U.S. at the time.
For men, yes, but just the opposite for women, because Jackie Kennedy, of course, who created fashion, brought the pillbox hat in particular into high vogue. And of course, in those days, everyone wanted to look like Jackie Kennedy. So yeah, the presidential fashions are interesting. Again, going back to George Washington, he wears a plain brown suit made of wool or material milled in Connecticut, and not a military uniform. Here was the general famous for leading the country through the Revolution, and this was to be a moment in which he was basically saying, we are a civilian government. We are not a government of a strong man. And that's a very, very important message, I believe, that Washington sent from the very, very beginning. And of course, one of the most famous portraits of him that hangs in the White House is of Washington in a plain civilian suit.
Love it. Really love it.
Really fascinating stuff. Yeah. Kenneth Davis, thank you so much for joining us.